Good morning. It's a great honour to be asked to be invited to start this conference off, to be the first speaker. I'm not so sure if everyone realised on the organising committee that I'd be retired when I came here. Maybe they wouldn't have invited me if they knew that. But I don't really see myself as retired. I'm still doing lots of things for the OED, and I've got lots of other online projects I want to get involved with as well. I have to try to speak quite slowly because I know that whenever I'm at a conference and everyone's speaking in English and not everybody is a native speaker, it's always my English they find the most difficult to understand. So I'll do my best. What I'm going to do is talk a bit about the historical side of things. I know most of you are involved in monolingual, bilingual dictionaries and technologies involved in that. The OED is a bit different in that we come from a historical tradition. We deal with the English language over the last 1,500 years up to the present day, not just in the UK, but wherever English is spoken. So we've got a sort of old world traditional view traditionally, because the dictionary started off in towards the end of the 19th century. But actually it was not since 2000, but since about 1983, when we first had the idea of putting the dictionary onto computer, that we've had to start grappling with all these issues of what fielded and tagged data is, etc. But things have changed dramatically over the years. I'm going to talk for a little bit, then I'm going to show some one or two short videos, etc., to try to keep your engagement up. The exciting thing about using things on the internet is that they can go wrong, and so you'll be able to watch out for when that happens. And I'll try and end at the end with a little time for questions, if you have any. So I'll start off with reading what I have, and then we'll move on to the computer. One of the grander questions we ask ourselves occasionally on the OED is the title of my talk: what would Dr. Murray have made of the OED Online today? Dr. Murray was the chief editor of the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. He was appointed to the post by the Oxford University Press in 1879 and continued as the dictionary's leading editor until his death 36 years later in 1915. That wasn't the reason that I stayed for 37 years, but I sort of realized it later on. But then he was chief editor from the very beginning. I was just a sort of cub lexicographer to start with. And he died while working on entries in the letter T, and so sadly he didn't live to see the completion of his life's work, which his colleagues eventually brought to a conclusion in 1928. Now, the OED, as you know, was not the first great national historical dictionary of the 19th century. That honour goes to the Deutsches Wörterbuch of the brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, of which the first volumes were published in 1854. The Dutch Woordenboek der Nederlands Taal followed close behind, with its first instalment appearing in 1863. But Murray led the OED on a different path, probably influenced by the fact that he was working directly for a publisher, Oxford University Press, rather than in the context of a university. And so even from the beginning he was dogged by very stringent deadlines, etc. The Dutch and German dictionaries started publishing in the mid-19th century, and the OED started to appear later in 1884. But both the German and the Dutch dictionaries were not completed until the second half of the 20th century, while Murray and his successors brought the OED to a rapid conclusion after only 44 years in 1928. This is the famous picture of Dr. Murray in his Scriptorium, the editorial office built by him, for him and his staff, in the back garden of his house in Oxford. It was a structure that had to be set down into the ground in his back garden several feet because the neighbours didn't want to overlook this rather strange construction. It's just in the residential area of Oxford. It doesn't exist any longer. It was knocked down. But it was said to be very uncomfortable for his editorial staff in the winter. It was a bit like working in a a sort of garage. And they said they had to put their feet in boxes lined with newspaper just to keep warm. They don't even give us boxes these days. Actually, could I have a glass of water as well? Because I feel it might be needed. You can see from the image of Dr. Murray that he's the very model of a Victorian lexicographer. He seems wiry, precise, painstaking, ancient, bearded and male. He keeps his shoes, as you can see, spotlessly clean. He's surrounded not by books, but by slips of paper, index cards combining little extracts from texts sent in to Oxford by the dictionary's readers and carefully filed in alphabetical order in a vast filing system maintained in part by his own daughters, who were paid a penny an hour or so to put these index slips into alphabetical order. This picture was actually taken, I think, by his grandson, who was at the time aged about 10, who'd just come up to Oxford with his parents to visit his granddad, and asked if he could take a little picture of him with his new camera. And it's ended up being the stereotypical picture of the old man. So for Dr. Murray, as he became, the OED was a very personal project. He set the agenda, he guaranteed the standards, he argued with the university press over timetables, selection criteria, staffing, budget, and all the normal aspects of running a major project. He had his own views on how successful his dictionary was. And he wasn't that modest. Here is what he said in a public lecture halfway through his tenure at the OED. I can't do the accent. It is never possible to forecast the needs and notions of those who shall come after us, but with our present knowledge, it is not easy to conceive what new feature can now be added to English lexicography. At any rate, it can be maintained that in the Oxford Dictionary, and the music starts now, permeated as it is through and through with the scientific method of the century, lexicography has for the present reached its supreme achievement. So what on earth would he have made of the dictionary today? Well, first of all, we should take a quick look at what happened to the OED immediately after Murray's time. As we've seen, Murray himself died in 1915, and the dictionary was eventually completed in its first edition in 10 volumes in 1928. Then in 1933, a supplement was produced, sweeping up many new words and meanings, often from the early days of motor transport, aviation, radio telegraphy, etc., which had come to prominence too late for the first edition of the dictionary. This was produced by two of Murray's surviving colleagues, so we assume he would have approved. This supplement included several terms which Murray later regretted omitting from the first edition, such as African, based on a proper name, so of course not right for the OED, until he realized he couldn't omit American, and appendicitis, which was first recorded just after the relevant installment of the OED for A was published. Appendicitis is first recorded from 1885, and that installment of the dictionary came out, I think, that year. That's the trouble with lexicography. You always miss the most topical words. The theme of supplements continued in the latter part of the 20th century with a 4-volume addition to the OED published between 1972 and 1986 under the editorship of Robert Birchfield. And it was on this project that I was first employed by the OED in 1976. The editorial style of both supplements was very similar to that of the original first edition of the dictionary. While Murray would doubtless have quibbled over some definitions and quotation selections, no two lexicographers, as you know, ever agree about anything all the time, he would probably have been in sympathy with the wish to keep the dictionary up to date with new material and to add the occasional earlier historical reference to the entries he compiled. But I can start to see Dr. Murray becoming rather edgy and nervous here. Let's pretend he's happy with the OED has progressed since his death in 1915 until, say, the 1950s. Would he have wanted another round of supplements, because that was the only way that the publishing world at the time could envisage updating a big dictionary, which it couldn't afford to re-edit in its entirety? Or would he have fought at that point for a comprehensive revision of the dictionary, the grand view of what they should do. He was an editor of enormous vision. He might have thought the business of tacking on accretions to the language in a supplement without bringing the rest of the text up to date with them was antipathetic to his character. We can't tell, but I just wonder. He sought elegance and concision. Did he want supplements to supplements to supplements? Whatever the case, his wishes would probably have been swept aside by the economic arguments of the day. There was no money at the time for a major re-edit, but only for an appendix. And what would he have made of the second edition of the OED in 1989 and the OED on CD-ROM in the early 1990s? By this time, editors and publishers in Oxford had started to look at new modes of presenting dictionary data. If the full OED and its supplement could be computerized, then that held out all sorts of promises for the future in terms of machine-readable searchability and dynamic update. I think Murray might have raised an eyebrow in curiosity here. Perhaps he would have seen that there was an opportunity here for his old dictionary. Maybe for the first time there was something in all this newfangled technology after all. And this, I'm not sure which is supposed to be me, but the bald one or the one with a beard. But anyway, this is just a cartoon that appeared in one of OUP's internal magazines soon after I said I was going to retire. It sort of misses the point, but what can you hope? So what does the OED look like? In case any of you haven't seen an entry from the OED before, I'll show you one now so that you can gain an impression of the wealth of information it potentially contains. I always find when talking to journalists that they come along and they want to talk about the OED, and actually all they've ever seen is the Pocket Oxford Dictionary or the Concise Oxford Dictionary, and they don't really understand that it's a large-scale historical dictionary with, this is only just the very top of the entry for European, which goes on for several pages, and various compounds, European Union, etc., all down the bottom, various subsenses of the adjective and the noun, etc., a long etymology, trying to bring in as many European languages as are involved in the development of the word before it enters English, and then a series for each sense of quotations, dated quotations from history, from the first recorded use of the word European, in this case as an adjective in 1555, up to the present day in all its various meanings. You can rapidly see that the OED, the historical OED, is not simply interested in meanings, but in variation in spelling over time, both in English and through the etymology in the languages which preceded English, in contextual use and in all sorts of other facets. In fact, we like to think that the OED reveals a word within its wider contexts and cultures. It makes you think, why was European used for the first time in English then? What were the social conditions and cultural conditions that made it appear in the language just at that time? And what did it mean in Latin or French at the time? Was there a semantic jump into English, or did it just carry on seamlessly its use in other languages? And all sorts of other cultural questions. This is the current revised entry. Our present long-term project is to update and revise the old dictionary, root and branch, by reassessing every aspect of every word against the available evidence. That's not what Oxford University Press, I think, thought we were going to do when we started off in the 1980s. But really, with the enormous mass of new material available every day on the internet, historical information, we have to reassess everything to produce a credible and an accurate picture of the language. We publish more and more revised entries online every 3 months, replacing the older versions, which had, until that time, been available on the online database. I'd like to flash backwards in time now, over 120 years, to Murray's original entry for European of 1891. These slides don't really do either justice to either version. You can see so little on a single screen. The full entry that I've just shown you, the modern entry, contains 11 screens worth of data, and the older version just 3, but each has its own strengths. From the comparison, you can start to see the changes that have been made since Murray's day on an editorial front. More data, earlier references. This first sense of European, for example, is dated by Murray as, from 1603, from Knowles's History of the Turks, whereas we now have it 50 years earlier, which is quite a substantial leap back in the language. And throughout the entry, we're able to provide more and better information. The etymology here in Murray's entry is quite short and concise. It doesn't give any historical dates of when the word, the cognate word for European first occurred in French, for example, which is significant for the development of the word as a whole. But from the comparison, you can start to see the changes made since Murray's day. More data, and wherever possible, more precise data. It's still a tight editorial profile, and it's available online on iPads, etc. But there are some things that we need to ask Dr. Murray about to see if he approves. The next section I've headed, Reasons to be Cheerful. First of all, I'd like to show you a PowerPoint slide from the days before PowerPoint. This is, in fact, a celebrated old overhead projection acetate prepared by my colleague Edmund Viner back in the mid-1980s. We used it regularly in those days to show audience how relatively easily the OED data was going to squeeze onto a computer database. In the end, we didn't shoehorn the entry into a relational database at first, but held it in a single string, indexed and searched by clever software written by colleagues at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And what you can see on this slide is that the different colors indicate the different fields of information. You can see that there are some very specific, to return to my text, otherwise I'll lose my place. But the point is that the way in which Murray chose to present information in the first installment of the dictionary, way back in 1884, changed very little over the course of its 44-year publication schedule, and indeed changed very little as the recent supplements to the dictionary became available in the late 20th century. You can see the fields identified by different colors. Some fields were finite in terms of possible content. There are only certain things that can appear in them, such as a part of speech field. Most of are a recognizable and therefore codable structure. So you can see within the etymology, or in the quotations, for example, there's the text of the quotation, there's the date of the quotation, there's the author and the title of the work, etc., which all fit nicely into database fields. And only a few, such as etymologies and definitions, are principally free-form, though still with some underlying structure. And etymologies and definitions are, we find, always the most difficult things to codify and classify and analyze. This isn't the case with the early volumes of, say, the old German and Dutch dictionaries I mentioned earlier. These, in the early days at least, have a much more fluid structure. They were written more as books, as articles to read, almost for pleasure, rather than as tightly structured objects. The OED benefits from both appearing reasonably late on the scene and also from Murray's very tight structured approach to his material. What made him a great lexicographer also made him a first-rate systems analyst. In his presidential address to the Philological Society in 1884, as he began work in earnest on the dictionary, James Murray made a prophetic claim. He thought that still earlier evidence could be found for as many as 75% of the words in his dictionary. He had a sharp grasp of his data. When we started revising the OED over 100 years later, we were able to find earlier evidence for about 30% of the vocabulary. With the quantum leap made in the availability of historical texts on the internet over the past 15 years, we're now currently working at an average of 60% of earlier references for each word or meaning. And it's not hard to imagine that Murray's figure of 75% could easily be reached. By claiming that 75% of the vocabulary could be antedated, Murray was really saying that every word, except for a small group of intransigent types, could be antedated. He doubtless held similar views on etymological and other information presented in the dictionary. Most of the information given by the OED, even today, is not absolute information. As soon as new data becomes available, all our transient certainties need to be re-evaluated. Last week, for example, the value of large-scale historical databases and the potential frustration they can cause was well demonstrated when a reader in the States presented us with a number of earlier examples of the word Puritan from the early English Books Online database. Murray had published his entry for Puritan with 1572 as the earliest reference to this Protestant party sect. we had not been able to improve on this when we revised the entry several years ago, despite scouring through our card files and through the principal historical online databases. But then one of the databases added some new material, as they annoyingly do from time to time, and the reader was immediately able to find two earlier references to the word, one from 1566, that's 6 years earlier, and by the next email post, he then sent a correction back 1 year earlier to 1565. So the text we have online today regularly changes as new data is found. When we first tagged and coded that entry for ladder that I showed you from the old acetate, we were using a very basic set of tags. In fact, we were using only start tags and relying on a parsing program to insert the relevant end tags at the correct place in the data. I mentioned that etymologies were only lightly structured free-form texts. Since then, we've attempted to take etymologies in hand. In each etymology, whether in a revised or unrevised entry, we've identified the language or languages from which each term is said to have been immediately borrowed into English, thereby ignoring, for the purposes of this specialized search, any other language in the etymology with which our term is only remotely associated, which you couldn't do on the original CD-ROMs of the OED. This is important. It allows us to use reliable data to display information about etymologies over time to the user. I think it's likely that James Murray would have appreciated this. In a moment, I'll run an animated sequence which shows over time from whereabouts in the world words entered English over the centuries. This data is all taken from the dictionary's etymologies. It's not reconstructed as a result of scholarly analysis. First of all, I'll show you a still image. First of all, I'll show you how to get temporary access to the OED if you don't have it, in fact. This lasts until the end of October. If you use the username conference-sept and the password harvest, for those of you who don't have access to it, then you should be able to see what I'm talking about. Many people I know have access to it through their institutions or whatever, but if you want to have a quick look, either while I'm talking or later on, then feel free to use conference-sept and harvest. But I'm afraid, like Cinderella's coach, it disappears at the beginning of November. Right, so this is a frozen screen from the animation, the 2-minute animation I'll show. But I wanted to show you this first because otherwise you can't easily understand what's going on in what you're seeing. What can we see here? First, the date 1800 in the bottom left-hand corner, surrounded by a sample of words first recorded in this year. As I say, this is taken from the dictionary's etymologies. It's not well, there's some processing involved, but it's basically the dictionary data. All the words in the OED and their etymologies analysed. Then the little bubbles you can see, each one represents a word in the dictionary, an entry in the dictionary. And the bubbles are different sizes depending on how many senses that word has. So you can start to see whether it's a big word in English, different senses in English, that is, or whether it's just a minor word. Each of the bubbles is plotted on the relevant region of the map of the world. So Greek words appear over Greece, for example. The language families have their own colours. And when you follow this animation, you'll see the history of the English-speaking peoples over the centuries marked by where they obtained their words from, and hence, as a sort of aspect of cultural history, with whom they were in trading or other contact with at the time. And I should say that some of the editorial issues with the data, there are some editorial issues in that American Spanish words show up over Spain for reasons. This is only a work in progress. It's not yet available on the website, but we're hoping to put it up soon. And there are other quibbles as well. But I think, taken as an example of how you can use OED data to inspire discussion of history and language, maybe in a schoolroom or university seminar, I think it's a revealing first step. Anyway, without further ado, it works. Here's the animation. Oh, I should say that you can also click on any of the little bubbles, and as you can see here, I clicked on one of the bubbles, this bubble here, and it's given a brief resume of what the word is. So now, with luck, here we are. The OED in 2 minutes. Starting from the year 1800, these early dates are, don't take them as gospel. Right, so here you are going through the Old English period, and most of the words entering English are Germanic, from the area in North Germany up to the Scandinavian languages. You can see it, even at this time, there are church words coming in from the Mediterranean area. We're getting up towards the Norman conquest of 1066, but what's significant as far as the record is concerned, it doesn't immediately show an influx of French words. There's not as much documentation for this period as we might like, but you start now seeing the red of the Romance words coming into English. Still a number of, and then they take over instead of bustling for position, all through the central Middle Ages and late Middle Ages period. I can stop it here as we go along, just to see. This is, I'm going to carry on, but this is 1332, and you can see that some of the words that entered the language, peregrinage, pilgrimage, Hurchen, angle, gar, burnish, and if you click on any of these little bubbles, here we are, wicker. This bubble here is wicker, Scandinavian word. Current frequency approximately 0.9 per million words. You can look at the word in the OED online. I've just slipped a bubble. Here we are. You can click on it and go to the OED entry if it's kind enough to show itself. Here we are. There. If you want to, and you can see that the first date must be, the dates in the first edition aren't always in, the senses aren't always in chronological order. But anyway, you can click there. Now, if we carry it, have we gone back to there, have we? Let's, sorry? Where were we? We were round about there. Let's go on from there. Sorry?
Fourth tab. You're in the
Fourth tab. Oh, there we are. Sorry. Computers, eh? There we go again. So we've still got this scrabble of words from France English. We're moving slightly to the early Renaissance, and so we can start seeing more happening in Greece and Italy or whatever. That expands a bit, but it's still surprising to see how many words are still coming into English from French. The odd word as we go into the 16th, 17th century, and much more around the world now. You suddenly start seeing words coming in from India, some North American Indian words. If we stop it there, beep, stops it on a not very good point. Let's go on a bit longer. Okay, well, we'll see what we've got here. Prasad, a Sanskrit word, first recorded in 1714. And over here we've got Pico, Chinese, tea, Saisi, Chinese. I don't, as I say, I haven't tested these particular words. So there's one or two Swedish words. Mainly, the Swedish words at this time will be likely as not scientific words. This doesn't show you what type of words are coming in. You have to look at the dictionary yourself for that. Anyway, let's carry on into the 18th century. And you can see the expansion of English power, I suppose, throughout the war. Look at all that. Hey, that's very exciting. And that's so here, as we go into the the early 19th century, you've still got French words coming in, méchant. These are not necessarily these aren't adenoid. Here we are, scientific words coming in here now, but a lot of Indian words, Hindi words, chota. For this, you can also click and see which word was that? Come on, little word. Let's try. Mendy. Okay, so if I go down here, I can click on to see what the Ngram viewer says about the word Mendy from 1800 onwards. Sorry, it's come there, hasn't it? So that shows that it does seem to, their evidence shows that the word, or at least the string of letters, appears on Google Books at around that sort of time. More frequent in the modern period. Obviously, these sort of graphs show different profiles for different words. Recalculate, what does Ngram say for that? Again, we're on 1813. Pop up here. Ah, it doesn't know it. Good old OED. There we are. Anyway, let's run the sequence to the end, and I'll find my place in my notes. Okay, I'll keep quiet now, but you can see what's going on. I hope you've got an idea of what it's trying to show anyway. But as a sort of teaching aid, or something to encourage people in the ideas that, and it would be nice to be able to do this for Latin and for Italian, French, Spanish, etc. You may not get, for Spanish you'll get quite a spread. Or for example, where French words went to, if we had comparable dictionaries throughout the world, you could see where French words, which languages French words went into, for example. So I think the sort of, I love the idea of using visual aids like this to enthuse people about the language. I've now got to get back to where I was before, which I think was here, which is good. I think Dr. Murray would have been puzzled by this. But on reflection, I think he would have been pleased that the structure which he'd initiated had been extended to allow more visual demonstration of the data. He himself was not averse to creating diagrams, at least, to illustrate his points. More work on etymologies. They're always a good aspect to illustrate. The enhanced tagging in OED's etymologies makes them fertile ground for diagrammatic or graphic illustration. Taking my start from the idea that Murray was not averse to diagrams, we can now look at how the OED Online shows etymological features in more detail. The online search software uses filtering to reach result sets, as lots of software obviously does these days. It filters etymologies by language of immediate borrowing. I'm going to shift from my backup PowerPoint pictures, I hope, to... Oh, that's not it. Where am I going to? Okay, so let's go to the OED. This is the OED database, and what I'm going to show you is how you can look at the data not just as text, but using the timeline facility on the database. And you can cut the data by language of origin. So we can look at all of the Central and Eastern Asian languages that are currently covered by the OED. And you can see that the borrowing was fitful into English in these languages from about 1500 or so. Not all that much going on. If you click on the various bars, you get a sample of the words that are first recorded in those years. So in the first years of the 18th century, you've got Xinshu, Tai Chi, Bing, Pongi, etc. And you can see that the data in the dictionary shows that the influx into English of words from this area of the world increases quite steadily into the 19th century. It sort of reaches a peak in the centuries where the OED was being first created. But later, what's interesting is looking at the types of words over each of these periods. So you can often see the early words they're often the sort of words that travellers bring back to England, or trading contacts bring back, words for marketable goods, etc. And in the later entries, they may often be scientific words, or his taikonaut was one of the ones there, or words to do with the arts, etc., that people became more interested in the later period. You can filter these results down to show, for example, just the Japanese words from that, so a subset of those words that entered English from Japanese. And from here, as you might imagine, you can see that there's a substantial period of time, except for all of these quotations, which largely come from a single translation of a German text of a Japanese book. They show that essentially Japan was closed to Western influence between about 1650 and 1800, and very little borrowing there, very little contact, very little trading contact travelling context, etc. And the sort of words that you find in the early days are words to do with the court, the sort of things that travellers would find. And in the later years, you find a lot more of the martial arts, art words, and sporting words, etc., literary words. And so the historical situation of interaction between the two cultures is shown, is revealed to some extent by the borrowing of the words from their vocabulary. Anyway, historical lexicographers use whatever materials they can lay their hands on. For this reason, I think our Victorian editor James Murray would have been enchanted with big data and computational analysis. I expect he would have been pushing maybe even harder than us for more data and more search software to be created and distributed. He knew the frustration of not having enough data. It said that when the old OED editors used to spend a disproportionately long time trying to collect together examples for everyday words which their readers had not sent to Oxford's card files. Readers tended to card surprising words like marginiform, margravial, or the mineral mariolite, rather than the humdrum, margin, margarine, or marine. And lexicographers need to describe the routine as well as the exceptional. So text corpora would have soon become standard fare for Sir James, I think. He, like us, would have wanted to inquire of the database which words and meanings he and his colleagues should consider entering into their dictionary. He was a practical cove, too. He would have been as happy as we are to omit words which exist only on the outer fringes of the language, while he waited for them to become more established and merit a place in the dictionary. But he doubtless have enjoyed the mathematical algorithms employed in understanding modern trends in language, and he'd also have enjoyed the pleasure of hunting through the residue of the past in search of new and better material. Large historical databases started to appear in earnest over 100 years after he started work on the OED, and I'm sure he would have been astounded at that distance in time that so very many texts are available for consultation through Google Books, the Internet Archive, the Harty Trust, and many other resources. Perhaps I can digress here along a short side alley for one moment to say that I run a James Joyce research website with a German colleague. One of the pieces we put up on the James Joyce online notes consists of a list of the hundreds of books owned by Joyce when he was living in Trieste after he moved there from Dublin, and where he wrote much of his earlier work. Here's a picture of part of one page. This assumes I can get back to the PowerPoint. There we are. This is just a snapshot of a small part of the letter P of the books in the library that he had in Trieste. And using archive.org and various other sources, you can see that I've managed to find links to more or less all of these texts, even though some of them are really quite out of the way and were published in Turin or in France or in Italy or whatever. It's absolutely amazing, as I'm sure many of you know, how many of these texts are available. I mean, we're lucky in English. This is one of the texts. This is the bottom one, Clive Phillips Woolley's Songs of an English Esau, published in London in 1902, and it's freely available there, accessible on the internet. You can read what often the exact edition that Joyce read. And I think Dr. Murray might be surprised how many people are involved in searching through large historical databases for the OED. In the old days, most of his information was acquired from readers around the world, making their way through real books, or what we quaintly called hard copy these days, though the expression only dates from the late 50s. I thought this short video might give you a taste of some of the online research that's part and parcel of the work for any OED editor today. And this is a short 2-minute video that's available on the OED.com website, freely available. It's actually on YouTube, so if you look up OED, writing the OED, I think you find it. I apologize for the funereal music at the beginning, which is what the production company put on, but it doesn't last very long. I just hope it doesn't set the scene. This is it's about one of my colleagues working on the expression potato salad for the OED.
We're revising the complete text of the OED because a lot of it dates from the late 19th century when the first edition was published. We started at the letter M about 5 years ago, and we've got to P now. And we're revising every word, looking for earlier examples of usage and recent examples. We don't have an end date at the moment because the text is growing enormously as we go along. But we're hoping that we'll see it before we retire.
Oh.
At the moment I'm working on potato salad. It was quite easy to find recent examples of usage of potato salad because it's a very common dish. But for earlier examples of words now, we can often turn to databases of facsimiles from the early modern period. What I'm going to do now is do a search for potato salad in the modern spelling and see if I get any results. And I see nothing's come up. But I'm not that surprised, actually, because potato was spelt in all sorts of ways in the early period. And one spelling we know was very common in around the 18th century was potato with an E. And yes, it looks like we've got a result. So that's very useful. And it tells us potato salad is a dish of high repute in some parts of Germany. So this is a great quote for us because it shows us that potato salad wasn't naturalised in this period. It wasn't seen as an English dish. We can key every piece of information we find into our own desktop editorial system. So sitting at our desk, we're in the centre of a great web of information that we can just pull in. We call it Pasadena, which is short for the perfect all-seeing, all-dancing editorial and notation application.
Some irony there, I think. Anyway, that's my colleague Bernie working on potato salad. And you can see from the entry here that the first example that we now have online, it comes from that text that she found, Count Rumsford's Essays on Political Politics, Economy and Philosophy. Potato salad, a dish of high repute in some parts of Germany. So, but on the other hand, tomorrow somebody might come up with an earlier example as new material goes onto these databases. One of the things that we have we've linked the OED text to is the OED Historical Thesaurus, which was an enormous project started at the University of Glasgow in 1962, I think, to take each of the meanings in the OED, write them out on index cards, because that's what you had to do then, and order them in a thesaurus order, rather like Roget's thesaurus. So you end up with here, for example, and you can link to it online, the area of the database connected to salad. Actually, I'll risk finding this on, where am I going? No. Here we are. Type in potato salad, as one often does. And here we are, here's the entry. Click on Thesaurus, and it'll take you to, it'll give you various comparable terms with the dates at which they were created. They're somehow related to potato salad. They're probably salads that the definition says they have potato in them. And then if you go to the actual network structure part of the thesaurus, under the section for salad, and click on that, you can see the entries for these types of salad here, and you can then click through to them. While you're there, you can also look at different words in English for sauerkraut, for example. Sauerkraut, 1617, in an anglicised spelling, a German spelling. Schuhkrut, a little bit later, 1849, kraut, liberty. It was called liberty cabbage at some point. It's great fun doing all this nonsense. Anyway, you can do that for any term in the language, essentially. I don't want to spend too much time on the thesaurus. I'll try to get back to where I was. Right, and you can do the same for arithmetic, for example. You can find different terms for arithmetic, which is the sort of thing you couldn't do in the old days with a printed dictionary, but you can do it instantly now. And you can link out from the OED to some other dictionaries. You can go to, if you're in the entry for Florentine, for example, and you have access to the Middle English Dictionary online, or then you can click through to that entry here, which is on not an OEP dictionary, but it's and we would very much like to be able to link we can link if we want to through to the Deutsches Wörterbuch or whatever, the French Trésor online. We haven't actually got that set up for use with the OED at the moment, but it's the sort of thing we'd like to have a whole hub of dictionaries, etc., that we can link into, as well as texts that we can link through to from the quotations in the OED as well. So there are all sorts of areas where we'd like to be working. I've shown you engrams already. What would Murray have come into the future with us? Supposing that Dr. Murray was working through the various features which any lexicographer, whether working on the OED or not, is at least passingly familiar today, what would he have made of them? So some of the ideas that Istok mentioned, the OED symposium we had recently, these were some of the things that we were discussing then. How you make the OED accessible on new generation devices. Does it fit really easily onto an iPhone, or do you have to look at only parts of the OED? You can see it obviously on an iPad without an app at the moment, but what's the future for apps on such a big dictionary as the OED? How much more crowdsourcing and the use of wikis can we do? I mean, it would be very nice to put the whole of the OED data up and let anybody make any alterations to a sort of wiki mantle around the OED, which the editors and everybody else can then see before it's actually integrated into the dictionary. That's the OED on an iPad. There is at the moment a secondary database hosted by a colleague of ours in America for science fiction vocabulary. So all of the science fiction vocabulary in the OED is put up there with its definitions, etc., an example of first use, and a whole bunch of science fiction guys pile into it and tell us new information about earlier uses of words from Amazing Science Fiction and various other magazines, etc., which because we can't do everything in Oxford. I mean, the more we can crowdsource and make obtain information from others, the better. So that's up and available for people to access, and also to also for the editors when we're working on these words. We put out appeals online these days. You might have seen some of them. We've managed to take the expression blue-arsed fly back 20 years or so through that. Somebody in the States came up with an earlier example for us. So we put these appeals for information on individual words up on the website every week or so. We'd like to make the OED free in some way. We're part of the University Press in Oxford. It's a commercial organisation and a charitable organisation. There are all sorts of conflicting models. Is a part of the OED that we could make available in a much less restricted way? What are the options for doing that? It's the sort of thing we're thinking about at the moment. Do we only publish the entries that we've finalised, or can we put stub entries up, words we're working on, words we know about, words we're monitoring? Is there an argument, and I think there probably is these days, that you don't just have the big authoritative dictionary, but you also have a sort of penumbra of data around it, which is data that's of interest to people, is working its way gradually maybe into being fully edited, etc., but is useful for people to see in other contexts. And finally, what would Murray have made of the language today? Here's something I found from Peter Larange's Viper's Nest in 2010. How sad that people no longer communicated in real words. By now he had mastered OMG, OSM, IMHO, LOL, TTFN and ROFL, but not SBS, such bofo shenanigans perhaps. Six Boom Shazam, Super Bowl Sunday. He winced as he remembered Sushi Burrito Special, a notorious product line that led to his company's demise. What would Dr. Murray have made of all of that? I think he'd have probably managed to come to terms with that too. Thank you. I've left a bit of time in case anyone has any questions. Otherwise, you can
we have two microphones circling around, so if you have a question, just raise your hand.
I have two questions concerning time aspects. One, I might have misheard. In the introduction, you said that you first had the idea of putting OED on computer in 1993. And I was wondering, how come not before?
Yeah.
If I did hear the year properly.
In fact, we were probably... the previous editor of the dictionary, Robert Birchfield, was very keen to get the 4-volume supplement to the OED completed. He started that in 1972, and it was eventually completed in 1986. So he sort of refused to allow computers into the OED at that time. And so the University Press at the time was a very traditional book publisher. It didn't really see a future. Didn't think of a future in terms of digital publications, etc. And so we were quite late into the market, but we were quite big into the market when we did get there. So yeah, it's quite. There were lots of concordances or whatever that were available at the time, and so. On the other hand, we were able to benefit from what other people had discovered at the time. So yeah, I mean, we could have been earlier, but even so, in retrospect, it seems quite early now. Yeah. And you had another question, which I hope is easier.
You said that there are publication of revisions every 3 months, and obviously you can do it instantly with any time an entry is revised today. So I was wondering, what's the concept on?
Well, I'd like to do it every day. As soon as when I was working on the OED until Monday, I'd have liked to have just approved an entry, pressed a button, and it appeared for everyone to see. It seems that we have to do various post-processing, etc., and we want to make doubly sure that things don't go wrong, so we put a time lag in, and we do them in batches at a time. That also helps our guys in marketing or whatever and publicity as well, because they can focus interest on these releases 4 times a year. But I mean, it would be technically feasible, obviously, to do it every day, and I would like to do that as an editor, but I'm not the only person that has a say. Well, I don't have any say now, but yeah.
I have a question about the timelines and your display of loan languages into English.
Yep.
I share your enthusiasm with this visual display, but I also see some problems. When you have loans from French, for instance, most of those words are ultimately from Latin, I gather.
Yep.
Whereas when we take a loan from Meso and South America, for instance, they have probably been entered into English via Spanish, for instance.
Yep.
So how do you cope with these paths of loans go through? Do you take the ultimate source or the immediate language?
Yeah,
how do you cope with that?
We take the immediate language at the moment. So if it's a Mesoamerican term that comes through Spanish, then it will say that it comes from Spanish into English. We could obviously expand the tagging to allow for more information about the priority of other languages back in history, in its timeline. For French words, we do a lot of work on whether a French word in the Middle Ages comes into English from French or from Latin or from both. And the chief etymologist on the OED is very, very keen in showing potential multiple borrowing, so that a word, we don't single-mindedly say that because that's not really how borrowing works. It doesn't just come at a single time from a single language necessarily, but it might enter English gradually over a period of 100 years from sources that are both Anglo-Norman or Central French or medieval Latin in any of its forms around the world. So we try to plot that as carefully as we can. You can't always show that in those timelines. Anything that you see visually, you really ought to use as a way of getting you into the data, and then you should check the actual data itself to be absolutely certain. But I think if you just present people with words, then with the extended range of people who have access to this sort of text now, it's great to be able to enthuse them into an idea through the visualization, but then to remember that it's backed up by sometimes more complex data behind it.
I have a question about social media, because we know that...
Sorry,
Oh,
sorry,
yeah,
hi,
yeah,
right.
Sorry.
Actually, should you introduce yourself? Does that help?
Sorry, yes.
Okay. Simon Krik from Slovenia. I have a question about using social media. What is your position on that? Because if I give an example, I know that New York Times, which is behind the paywall, what they do is they, if somebody clicks on a link on Facebook or Twitter or something, they allow everybody to access their articles, data, and so on, because they want their news to become viral. So,
well, what happens is that we don't really run the OED's Twitter account. It's really organised by our marketing publicity guys, and if they're putting a particular tweet out about a word, they'll usually allow access to that entry in the OED through a link from that Twitter link. We do a word of the day on the OED, so every day you get a new entry if you sign up to it. But we worked out it would take you 990 years to collect all of the entries. So it's not as if we're worried about sort of losing access to the whole of the day. And the entries are changing anyway every 3 months. So, but some entries are linked through to, and others you have to have a subscription for. So yeah, but as I say, we're looking very much at ways at which of making parts of the dictionary accessible, substantial amounts of the dictionary available free. We'd like to do that. I would like to make the whole thing free, but again, I don't have a say. Yep.
Hi, I have a question. Gregory Greffenstedt. Are there words in the OED that only appear once or have only one citation?
There are in the... I don't think we've had any new words in that category. Historically, James Murray did put in single uses, hapax legomena, from major authors. We would include those only if they were backed up by discussion and used by other people as well. So nowadays, the criteria, the policies change slightly, so we don't put single uses in. We're looking for evidence of more widespread use, but in the historical, because the dictionary is a sort of palimpsest of various times, some of the what were thought then to be single uses by canonical authors were included in their own right. Nowadays, we're finding when we revise those, we often find that there is extra information in less known authors from the time, and we're able to include that as well. That's much more satisfactory. But in the old days, because they had a limited number of readers and limited amount of time, they tended to concentrate for literary texts on big authors rather than the massive material we have available from every level of literature nowadays.
And one related follow-up question. Is it like Hotel California? Do words ever leave?
No. Not in the big OED. They stay there. Once they're there, they're there. And we do sometimes re-evaluate an entry in the first edition of the dictionary. So we actually say, well, actually that was a misreading of a manuscript, and so that entry shouldn't really be there. So we tend to leave a note saying that entry shouldn't really be there, and this quotation really belongs under this other word. But no, the principle is that if it's there, if it's of interest, it's part of the sort of snapshot of the language at a particular time, so it stays there.
I think we have time for one last question. Then it's time for a coffee break.
Yeah, good.
So thank you very much.